Welcome to the next in our Pakistan 100 podcast series. My name is Ali Hasanain. I'm delighted to welcome today Saroop Ijaz. Saroop is a lawyer and he's the country representative of Human Rights Watch in Pakistan. He's also a member of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan and writes regularly in newspapers columns for the general public. Saroop, welcome. Sarup has agreed to come here today to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart, which is press freedom. Pakistan has traditionally been thought of as a relatively free system in terms of the freedom that our journalists enjoy relative to other South Asian countries. But we're still a relatively unfree country. And in particular, we've had a decrease in our World Press Freedom Index in the last few years. This has come on the back of greater censorship of websites, disruption of newspapers and TV channels distribution, the abuse by political parties in power of ad spending, physical violence and threats towards journalists, and denial of access to locations. So, with that background, Sarup, can you start us off with just telling us a bit about what our constitution says about freedom of speech?
Yes, what our constitution says about the freedom of speech is Article 19, and which lays the larger framework for the environment for free expression in Pakistan. And what Article 19 of the Pakistan Constitution of 1973 says that every citizen shall have freedom of expression and speech, and there shall be freedom of press, subject to reasonable restrictions imposed in the interest of glory of Islam, integrity, security, and defense of Pakistan, in the interest of morality, decency, public order, friendly relations with foreign states, with in relation to contempt of court, or in relation to commission of an offense, or any other reason that the law may deem fit. There are other countries which have. It varies. India has a fairly similar free expression article. There, as the other extreme would be the US, where it's just freedom of expression. But that enabling environment creates an architecture where there is structural opposition to free expression in the country.
So there'll be a lot of non-lawyers watching this, hopefully. And so, just for them, a constitution is meant to give us the outline of what the law is, and then it is up to, in a common law system, it is up to the courts to fill in the details of what is or is not allowed in practice, correct?
Yes, the courts interpret what the contours of a constitutional provision would be, but also when it is a fundamental right, it is also, what that means is that any citizen can go to court and enforce that.
Sure.
Yep.
Got it. So, compared to our constitution, what would another constitution say about freedom of speech? How would we compare?
As I said, it varies from country to country. There is.
I'm thinking of a more mature democracy.
Yes. So for example, in the US, it's the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, and that test is. It's essentially absolute freedom of expression, subject, save as interpreted by the courts, where there is incitement to violence or incitement to commit an offense, where words have consequences outside of that, so outside of mere speech. And in terms of being exhaustive in terms of clawbacks, I think we are on the other end of the spectrum, where it essentially vests great degree of power with the state or the government to take back or curtail freedom of expression on, as I said, as outlined on any number of grounds.
Right. So you're saying that freedom of speech is a general rule in other legal systems, with relatively few exceptions, and we have many more exceptions to the right of freedom of speech here. What is the limit to what I can say when I say India is a bad country, for example?
Yeah.
To what extent can I say that?
And that, I think you've identified in your question what the problem here is. The problem is you as a citizen, you and I as a citizen, have no way of doing that till we've made that speech. And then it would be a court which will define it. So it is as because these are things, for example, glory of Islam or integrity of Pakistan. These are concepts which are broad concepts, in which and some of them have been defined by courts at some level. Some of them are completely undefined, and some of them, as the example that you gave, are in a state of flux that might vary from where it was 5 years ago or where it is now. And what that means is, as a citizen, you don't know if you are entitled to make that speech till you have made it.
But sir, isn't this true everywhere? So in the US, if you said maybe a fire will break out, that might be just below the threshold, and then subsequent cases will clarify that.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it is true in the sense that most of these determinations will be made once the speech is made, and that instance will be used to lay down the law for future instances, or in certain cases, or inform lawmaking. But the idea in most cases, particularly with fundamental rights, from a human rights standpoint, for example, is to make the grant of the right to be as clear as possible, and make the exceptions to it as narrow as possible. So where the primary focus is the right. I mean, talk about, just go circling back to what we were talking about, the crowded fire in a theater. I mean, there are other tests in the US, fighting words, etc., as well. But I mean, there is a distinction also to be made between an assertion of a fact or an opinion. So the example that you gave, for example, or the example that we were talking about, might be opinions, as opposed to saying that there is, as opposed to an assertion of fact, which, of course, if it is done with deliberate knowledge, it would not fall under.
So that brings me actually to defamation. What is defamation?
Defamation has, I mean, two components, which is slander and libel. But for ordinary public, I mean, layman terms, it is when a statement is made with a deliberate intent to either harm a person's reputation or lower their reputation. I mean, and in the Pakistani law, in the eyes of either the general public or to a specific audience. So it's a false statement made deliberately, and often in most jurisdictions with an element of malice, with the intention to hurt someone.
And is it a statement of fact alone or opinion also?
It's generally, it should be a statement of fact, but so in certain cases can be, if it relates to, if an opinion is aired which is calculated to hurt someone, it could, but generally it's a statement of fact.
As I understand it, commonly defamation is mostly a statement of fact. We were having this discussion also about the difference in defamation laws, the architecture of defamation law in the US and UK, which are the two, I guess, fountainheads of common law, as most other countries understand them. I don't know if you characterize it that way. Can you tell us a little bit about those interesting differences?
So, I mean, in broad terms, the US defamation law is far more permissive of free expression than the UK, and that is, as I said, going back to the architecture of free expression in the US. In most cases, the person who's making the claim of being defamed will have to prove that it was done through malice, it was done deliberately, and then, of course, it would vary if it's a public person or private person. In the UK, in certain cases, the onus can be shifted, if it's, and particularly if it's publications, and the journalist or the person who's making the statement might have to prove that they did not intend to do this, and that has had a chilling effect on free expression, on publication, on the business of journalism in the UK in the past.
So let me summarize again some of those differences. The first is that in the US, you need to prove that a journalist who wrote negatively about you was doing it with actual malice, or an intent to harm you. So a mistaken statement about you is, they're not liable for that. The second is that if you are a public figure, the US says you have, by a public figure, it means someone who has access to media. You can then go back and claw back your reputation by making counterclaims. and so it's much harder for you to win a case.
Yeah.
And number three, in the US, the evidence that is brought to, or the proof that is brought into the case, the burden of that falls mostly on the person that is defamed.
Yeah, it is
Whereas in
really different.
in the UK, it is the journalist.
Yeah.
Also. Are those the major differences?
Those are the major differences.
And so, inherent in this is, in the difference between the contrast between the US and the UK, is a recognition that freedom of speech has both benefits and costs that it creates for society. The UK decides to be less permissive because it thinks perhaps that the drawbacks are more weighty, whereas the US is more permissive. Where does Pakistan stand, and what is this sort of the idea of criminal defamation here?
So in Pakistan stands, I mean, I would say somewhere in the middle. It's not as permissive as the US, it doesn't go as far as the UK. But still, the onus would lie on the person who's making the claim of being defamed. So that remains true. Criminal defamation is as opposed to civil defamation, where you're only asked to, I mean, either retract that statement or or pay damages. Criminal defamation is when there could be a criminal sanction attached to it, which might not necessarily be a jail term, which could only also be a fine, etc. So in Pakistan, Pakistan has both sorts of defamation, but the fundamental problem in Pakistan is, as opposed to both other, one important distinction, if we're making that comparative analysis, in Pakistan, this adjudication is done by a court and not a jury, as opposed to there, in terms of the quantum of what would happen. If somebody has to pay after being found guilty, would be done by jury. Secondly, the defamation laws in Pakistan, since 2002, when a new defamation law came in place, have largely remained non-enforced. So nobody, in Pakistan, it is almost impossible to get a defamation award, which would mean that when somebody is ordered to pay damages, where it's punitive, where I am punished for doing this. In certain cases, you're asked to render an apology, retract a statement, take it off a website. But what that means is the defamation law in Pakistan remains completely unenforced. And again, as I said, there is no place for criminal defamation in all of this, because it's complicated as well. There are provisions of the PPC which deal with that. But because that would have a chilling effect on free expression or freedom of speech in an entirely different way. But to have a functional defamation law infrastructure which takes into account all considerations of due process, transparency, and fair trial, in many cases can further, this free, at some level, free expression, but journalistic enterprise.
So, freedom, when we talk about press freedom, defamation isn't a big deal in terms of the restrictions that we have there.
Defamation, as opposed to a lot of other countries, defamation is, while it is a challenge, because like many of Pakistan laws, it's vaguely worded, but the problem is, and interim injunctions and restraining orders might be a problem, but it's not the seminal challenge to free expression or freedom of press in Pakistan. But now I think there are multiple challenges. Part of the challenge is the media structure itself, which has to do with ownership structures, which has to do with how the media functions, which is on its reliance on government subsidy or advertisements, which takes away independence because it gives leverage to the government, which is also now what we're seeing. And I think in recent history in Pakistan, a factionalization of the media, which is unprecedented, where the Pakistan media, the polarization, where the media is not willing to put up a common front, even against most elemental challenge to free expression. So while the state intimidation and harassment remains, while censorship, direct censorship, is a problem, and it remains, there are other challenges to the media as well, which are, as I said, are structural part of it, stage of evolution problem part of it, are parts of how the broadcast media is now. I mean, as happened with the print media, with the advent of broadcast media, now we're seeing new forms of media, which means it's a sometimes a crisis of credibility, sometimes it is challenges of competence, but it's so now there are multiple challenges as opposed to only where you used to have an overbearing state who would blank out a paper, who would pick someone up. Now you could be fired, as you said in your introductory remarks. Now it could be a supply distribution problem. It could be a cable operator taking you off, which again is so all of this architecture of censorship has become more sophisticated. It is it's sometimes it's one step removed, sometimes it has plausible deniability, but the media with the state at which it is in terms of divisions is also something new in Pakistan. The media is always, uh, regardless of ideological leanings, has gotten together and put up a unified front for for freedom of expression. Now we're at that stage where the factionalization is such and the polarization so intense that that is unlikely to happen, and that makes the media vulnerable to intimidation and harassment by the state, by media owners, by corporate actors, by political parties.
So I want to come back to I don't know if it's defamation or freedom of expression, but there were a few recent examples of where expression has been curtailed. The first was the visit of the Saudi Crown Prince to Pakistan on the back of the scandal of the murder of the reporter Jamal Khashoggi. And there were people who put up profiles of the murdered journalist as their profile pictures, and this was deemed to be um, undesirable or rude towards the visiting state guest, and there were actions that were taken or threatened to be taken against these people. Another is the recent controversy about the use of the term "selected prime minister." Um, where does the state draw its power to curtail such expressions from?
In the case of the visit of the Saudi Crown Prince, my understanding is that the law deployed was the Pakistan Electronic Crimes Act of 2016, which is a legislation passed under the previous government, which a lot of human rights organization and civil rights campaigner, digital rights campaigner, uh, uh, opposed on the grounds that it uses language which is vague and it can be used to criminalize peaceful expression. But as I said, because the constitution itself uses terms which are friendly relation with foreign states, that allows for subsequent sub-constitutional legislation such as that, and but also allows for an enabling environment to go after those journalists. I don't think that the court of law would hold the act that you of putting up a profile picture uh, as falling into either of those categories. But the fact that those laws exist allow for the state to use that power. The second example is of the recent controversy in the prime minister. Uh, that is again that's the objection or the ban that they seek to impose on the use of the word selected prime minister is in the context of the parliament itself, in more specifically the National Assembly. It was the Speaker of the National Assembly who said, that he would not allow that. And that is again, that's another form of protected speech. I don't think that that reflects very well on free expression in Pakistan. And secondly, it's also that highlights, outside of a legal perspective, of how banning words or acts have the exact opposite effect. because what I saw the next day was the New York Times and the Khalij Times and everyone else doing a story on that ban.
Yes.
So partly it is modern states or authorities realizing that these acts in themselves, they are not only overbroad or draconian, they're also counterproductive.
Yes. So you had mentioned the Pakistan Electronic Crimes
Yeah.
Act. We also know that PEMRA has been reconfigured. Its powers have changed over time. Can you just give us a little summary of PEMRA?
Yeah. So PEMRA, which is the Pakistan Electronic Media Regulatory Authority, was formed under an act of 2002, which was again drawing from the permission of the Constitution to impose reasonable restrictions, and that coincided. Of course, the primary purpose of that was to deal with a media which had just recently been liberalized by General Pervez Musharraf, and where you moved from one state broadcasting, broadcaster, which is namely PTV, to dozens of other channels, and how to deal with that. And it, in terms of the free expression bit, it took language from the Constitution and imposed all of those restrictions. It was subsequently amended, most notably in 2007, where the powers of the PEMRA were increased in terms of seizing, in terms of going after media houses, or in terms of actions that they could take. Recently, because of proceedings in the Supreme Court during the caretaker government, which is, I think, approved in the last cabinet meeting of the previous government, was the powers of the powers of PEMRA have been sought to be increased in but differently, which is not coercive powers, but to powered in as opposed to being independent from government control. Because as a media regulator, it was not meant to be a body which is ancillary to the government, because that would kill, of course, the regulatory component of it. But it had what we saw and what we still see to some extent is that PEMRA is very effectively and closely controlled by the government or the Ministry for Information and Broadcasting, for example. Owing to proceedings in the Supreme Court and following directions of the Supreme Court, there have been some changes which, for example, reduce the number of government members in a part of PEMRA. It seeks to make the Council of Complaint a more efficient body. And again, those are perhaps steps in the right direction. But the fundamental problem of PEMRA is a question of independence in terms of when you have a Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which many countries in the world don't. If you have a state broadcaster, and then you have an independent regulator, you don't have a government ministry, which, why would you have a government ministry and a regulator and a separate state broadcaster? Mm-hmm. Because that creates a confusion. So, and I think that structural imbalance gives the ministry, and by extension the federal government, disproportionate power over PEMRA, which needs to change. But also, when PEMRA was formed, it was formed to deal with a completely different media landscape, unrecognizable now, which is, a post-PTV world where you started to have television channels. Now you have television channels. Firstly, the numbers are incredibly different. But second, now that you have a digital media ecosystem, which is growing at a rapid rate, which requires the state to deal with it differently. And second, with media houses adopting to technologies in terms of streaming, etc., differently. So PEMRA needs to, whatever body Pakistan forms, the authorities form, first it has to be an independent regulator. The interface between the federal government and a regulator, be it in media or, as you know, in any other dimension, it kills the purpose. And so while these are steps in the right direction, there's still much to be desired.
I want to start wrapping this up, and I'd like you to maybe close this off by speaking to the importance of law and other factors, and where you see freedom of expression in Pakistan going in the next 5 or 10 years.
Absolutely. Very briefly on the point you're saying that the media being representative not only of the majority, which is rural voices, which is women voices. If you look at the op-ed writers or anchors, which is non-Muslim or religious minority voices, that also speaks to credibility, because that is also the credibility that the media has with the large, at least the widest cross-section of population, is often an insurance against censorship, where people actually feel that now the media shouldn't be censored. So that should be done to that extent. In terms of what lies ahead, I fear that the space for free expression in Pakistan will shrink further. Part of it has to do with larger democratic space, and media or the press does not operate in a silo. And if there is democratic backsliding in that sense, that it would, I think freedom of expression would be the first casualty. Secondly, I think what modern states are doing now, and across, it's a worrying trend, is that they are becoming very sophisticated at this. Which is, for example, you don't have to shut down a social media platform, because that would create a ruckus that you don't want, and that would be censorship. And what you can do is you can flood it with information that you want to broadcast, and that is problematic in its own sense, but you're not shutting a platform down. And that we're seeing, it's a problem in the region, it's a problem around the world, really. Second, I think, thirdly, there is now, because of the new model, which is not to go after only journalists, but to deal with either through bureaucratic strangulation or financial squeezing, or to get media houses in line, to know that, to build that consensus, to have them converge to a certain point. And many of the media houses are less committed to the cause of freedom of press, particularly if it's a commercial concern, than a journalist was. And so there might be regulatory measures, there might be legislative measures that put that into practice. But as things stand now, and so lastly, I think because the factionalization or the polarization of the media that I mentioned earlier, it makes them vulnerable to all of this. It makes them, because what it does is, as opposed to in the past, where you could look at a media outlet or look at a newspaper and know that the ideological bent is such, and that is how analysis is being informed. But now it's not. It's not only comment is free and facts are sacred, facts are not sacred. What you can see is, which is again a global phenomenon, which is not a consensus on, let's say, what happened in a particular instance, and then have to do right-left analysis, where if you were reading particular publications or consuming certain sorts of news, your version of what happened yesterday is drastically different, and that makes the media as a whole very vulnerable. Some of these challenges are, I think, universal, and they're part of the moment of an inflection point of new media technologies. But many of those are specific to Pakistan. As I said, it is linked to democratic ethos, norms, and how thriving and robust Pakistan's democracy is. And if that space shrinks, which sadly I think will before it gets better, media, as I said, will be the first casualty.
It's very clear from the discussion today that press freedom is one of the safeguards of democracy and also one of the first items that are challenged. It's up to all of us to work together to ensure that we arm ourselves and our fellow citizens with the best information possible to make the right choices about who our leaders are. Anyway, Saroop, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.